먼저 내 삶을 바꾸는 혁신적 포용국가를 주제로 로버트 라이시 미국 UC버클리 정책대학원 교수의 첫 번째 기조 강연이 있겠습니다. Professor Robert Reich, may I invite you to the stage to deliver a keynote speech, please. 여러분 큰 박수로 맞이해 주시기 바랍니다.
I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak with you today on Korea's growth as an innovative and inclusive nation. It's a true privilege for me and for my wife to be here in Korea, in South Korea, at this particular juncture in history. I speak to you not as an expert on Korea. You are the experts on Korea. But as someone who has spent much of his professional life researching the relationship between economic growth, innovation, and social inclusion, and someone who, as a government official in the United States, has sought to develop policies that fostered both growth and inclusion. My hope is that what I have to say to you today is useful to you and relevant to your work here in Korea. I also want to say at the start that the economic growth of this country over the last 5 decades is utterly astounding. Those of us in the United States who have watched and understand the processes of economic growth around the world continue to tell ourselves that Korea is remarkable. No other nation in history has progressed so rapidly from poverty to first world wealth. Your capacity to improve productivity and to innovate is also remarkable. The question I wish to raise with you today is about the future, not about the past. You now rank among the world's leading economies. Many of your industries are at the leading edge of global competition. So how do you continue to grow and to innovate? What is the path for the future? And most importantly, how does social inclusion figure into that path? It is very difficult to generalize from the experience of different nations with very different histories and cultures. But I want to draw your attention to 7 variables that I consider to be critically important in terms of growth, innovation, and inclusion. First of all, young people have a particular stake in social inclusion. More inclusive societies make it easier for young people from any economic stratum to become entrepreneurs through access to 2 critical things: education and financial capital. Innovative nations have fewer barriers based on family wealth or family connections. To state this another way, innovation goes hand in hand with equal opportunity. You have only to look at world history. If you look at world history, you can see that the most innovative societies that fostered invention experimentation, learning, and therefore economic growth, were societies marked by unusual opportunity relative to other societies at the time. If you look, for example, at Venice in the 15th century, the Ming dynasty in the 15th and 16th centuries, Holland in the 17th century, England in the 18th and 19th centuries, the United States in the 20th centuries, all of these were societies in which great wealth that had been concentrated in the hands of a relatively few families began to break up and create new opportunities for enterprising individuals who were not necessarily wealthy and who often lacked traditional connections. Now, opportunity was hardly equal, but in these places and at these times, opportunity became far more equal than it had been. What this means for all of us, all of our contemporary societies, is that we've got to be particularly mindful of creating equal opportunity and also sustaining equal opportunity. My second point relates to the first, and that is that economic growth is not a trade-off. It is not inconsistent with social inclusion. There is a tendency in some quarters, among some economists and others, to believe that fairness is inconsistent with growth. The empirical evidence shows that that is not the case. In fact, quite the contrary. The only way growth can be sustained over the long term is through widespread prosperity. Growth is led by increasing aggregate demand, which in turn is fostered by more people with more income to spend. This in turn depends on the spending of the bottom 60 to 80% of the population by income. Now, this point needs to be widely understood in every society. The rich spend a smaller portion of their incomes than everyone else. So the goal must be a virtuous cycle of growth and widespread distribution of the benefits of that growth. Because the widespread distribution of the benefits of that growth creates more opportunity. In the United States, we now have a very unequal society, and we are suffering from very slow growth. The richest 1% in America are now taking home about 18 to 20%, by some measures 21% of total earnings. Now, there is no way that aggregate demand can be sustained under those circumstances. In 2 years that I want to point out to you, 1928 and 2007, the richest 1% in the United States took home over 22% of total national income. I raised those 2 years, 1928 and 2007, for a good reason. Because in the years following both of those peak levels of inequality, we had economic catastrophes. The first leading to the Great Depression of the 1930s, the second leading to the Great Recession, which could have been a Great Depression, had government officials not handled it better. My third point is this. We know also that innovation is highly correlated, historically and around the world, with social mobility. In every generation, there is a potential wealth of talent that can either find expression in new ideas, inventions, and creativity, or it can be discouraged and subdued. Where inequalities of income and wealth are wide, and social rigidities make it difficult for young people to get ahead, cynicism can predominate. Some young people decide there's no point in starting a new business or developing a new invention. Economic stresses may also deter them from starting families, which can lead to a vicious cycle of an aging society without adequate purchasing power and high youth unemployment. We have seen something of this pattern in Europe over the last several decades. The answer seems to be, and again, when I suggest answers here, I don't mean to be presumptuous. I'm merely trying to generalize from the data we have around the world. The answer seems to be public investment in education, job training, infrastructure, research and development, and also wage subsidies. These are properly viewed not as public expenditures, but as public investments. Our national income accounts don't draw the distinction between expenditures and investments, but they are deeply important investments in the future, not spending on today. Number 4, and my fourth variable, is the degree to which domestic companies compete with one another and the internal dynamism of markets. Now, this is also a matter of social inclusion or exclusion in the following way. Concentration of economic power in a few major industries or industry groups can aggravate inequalities and dampen the development of new business entrants. This is because concentrated monopolies or oligopolies themselves create substantial barriers to entry. Now, I want to emphasize to you that these barriers are not just economic. Large, dominant companies can exert substantial influence over politics and thereby get enacted laws and regulations that make it more difficult for smaller businesses to enter a market. I want to again refer to the United States, where the rate of small business formation and new entrants has slowed dramatically over the past several decades. And this is true even in high technology. A large part of the problem has been the growth of very large and dominant firms, such as Google, Apple, and Amazon, which exert both economic and political power. The huge capitalization of these firms gives them the power to undercut the pricing of any smaller firm. And even the threat of predatory pricing can be enough to deter new entrants. The answer here is twofold. One is stronger anti-monopoly policy. The second is political reforms that make it harder for money to affect policy making. Which brings me to my fifth factor, connecting innovation to social inclusion. It has to do with the extent to which a nation's wealth is in the hands or under the control of a relatively few people, or to the contrary, is widely shared. We know from the experience of many different societies that concentrated wealth tends to discourage innovation for two reasons. First, decisions about where and how to invest that wealth are made by a comparatively few, leading to rather conservative and predictable investments, often to insiders, economic insiders with often political connections. Where wealth is more widely dispersed, capital markets are more dynamic, and investment decisions reflect a far wider array of possibilities. The second danger in concentrated wealth is the takeover of democratic institutions, to which I have already alluded, but permit me to get a bit more specific. Where politics are dominated by concentrated wealth, laws and public policies tend to favor that wealth to the detriment of small businesses, new entrants, smaller investors, and innovators. A vicious cycle can ensue in which such laws and policies further concentrate wealth, which in turn can exert even more political power to get even more laws and policies that favor that wealth. The broader public, left out of this process, can become angry, viewing the entire system as rigged for the benefit of the few. This situation can be an invitation to demagogues to build their political power on that anger and channel it toward scapegoats, such as foreigners or immigrants or minorities within a nation. This has happened historically before. We are seeing something like this occurring in Eastern Europe and various other places around the world as right-wing and intolerant xenophobic political movements take hold. I will not comment directly on what is happening in the United States because I think it would be inappropriate for me to mention our current president, and so I will refrain from bringing up our current situation. Number 6. My sixth point is that the geography of growth and inclusion is very important and often neglected when we're talking about these subjects. It is often useful to encourage centers of innovation outside of major urban areas. We know that where business, finance, education, and politics are geographically centralized in one or a few major cities, innovation can be dampened because the cost of housing in those centers makes it difficult for those without much by way of money or assets to get in, imposes a barrier to entry on those without connections, encourages subtle forms of graft and bribery, and fosters conformity. There is a natural tendency for capital cities to become the centers of business, finance, education, and politics. After all, that is where the action is. But real innovation often thrives in places far away from those centers. One obvious example from the United States is Silicon Valley, just about as far removed from Washington, D.C. and New York as you can get. Now, one answer here is that government can play a constructive role in diversifying the geography of innovation through fiscal policies, that is, taxes and targeted spending, that encourages new geographic centers of innovation. Seventh, and finally, I want to emphasize the importance of openness and diversity. Social inclusion welcomes differences. It celebrates and takes joy in people who have different traditions, histories, even different political views. It embraces minorities. It embraces women who often do not have opportunities to be innovators and take roles of economic leadership. Throughout history, societies that are the most innovative are those that are the most open to new ideas and influences. By contrast, societies that isolate themselves from other societies, that cut themselves off from other cultures and other modes of thought, cannot innovate because they look inward rather than outward. They cannot learn from the rest of the world and, in effect, choose not to. For the same reason and in the same way, cultures that are racially and ethnically homogeneous, that recoil from foreign influences and peoples, and reject even different political views, that do not provide opportunities to women, tend to become backward. By being exclusive rather than inclusive, they succumb to drab conformity and predictability. The great irony in all this is that while social inclusion tends to foster innovation and growth, innovation and growth don't necessarily lead to greater social inclusion. In fact, there is some evidence that growth may, over time, make societies less equal, creating a class of owners and entrepreneurs who accumulate vast wealth and thereby separate themselves from the rest of society. What we are witnessing among all of the world's advanced economies is widening inequality of income, wealth, and political power. A relative few are successfully riding the waves of technological innovation, and part of the issue here that you will talk about, I'm sure, today is technological innovation and also of globalization. While much of the rest of society is shut out. This phenomenon is slowing growth, and it's contributing to political polarization. In other words, we may, all of us, be facing a paradox in which it becomes important for a society that wishes to stay innovative and productive to be vigilant against social inclusion, finding ways to be socially innovative as well in terms of spreading the benefits of economic growth, fostering opportunity, and encouraging social mobility. You see, this is not and should not be a zero-sum game. It is and can be a positive-sum game. When we talk about politics and economics and morality, we are really talking about aspects of the same fundamental subject. If we seek out ways in which everyone can benefit from growth, everyone can benefit from innovation, we actually find ourselves in a society that is a better society morally and socially. We must not think that economic growth, peace, and a good society are separate issues and separate questions. They all blend together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Robert Reich, for sharing your insights and pointing out the 7 important factors. 네, 교수님 정말 감사합니다.